The Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy.
Hello there, you are watching/listening to The Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy. My name is Josh Edison, he is MRX Dentith.
That's true, I am MRX Dentith.
Is that your preferred collection of initials, or do you just...
Well, yes. I mean, I have a lot of initials, as you know.
There are quite a few. There are more. I could have said more, but I didn't.
If we did go for the full set, which is MRXXXXXXDHOR Dentith, that's just a mouthful. And it'll make the intro to the podcast really long.
When instead we can just crack on and say, we can say Happy Diwali.
We can say Happy Diwali.
Goes for 5 days, or is it 7?
I don't know, because I actually wasn't... I knew it was kind of around now, but I didn't know it was today, so didn't do any background research.
Well, there you go.
And now I feel like a bit of a moron. I should know about the many cultures that make up our wonderful panoply of cultures in Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Indeed. Especially since Diwali is celebrated in India, the world's second most populous country.
And also a country that my family used to rule when we were part of the Raj back in the Victorian era.
British colonialism, what can't it do?
Don't get me started.
So we're back on the false flag kick again. But there is no shortage of them, so that's just going to work out fine.
You say there's no shortage of them, there's only 2 more on our list.
Well, on our list, but that's because we have a short list we could add to our list. Ad infinitum, maybe though, we should get off the false flag kick after a little while.
Yes, I think we should go on and do something different.
But not today.
No, today it is just false flags.
It's the comforting soft blanket of false flag conspiracy theories. But first, of course, it is the news.
It is.
It's also a cat. Where did that come from?
Outside the door.
Oh, okay. I thought maybe she was hidden under a pile of blankets or something.
That is perfect timing.
Breaking conspiracy theories in the news.
So, lots of news this week. Let's start local. This last week saw the 10-year anniversary of the October raids in Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Yes, in mid-October 2007, the New Zealand police executed a series of raids across the country to apprehend suspected Tino Rangatiratanga, or Maori sovereignty, terrorists who had attended terror training camps for terror in the Uruweras.
At the time, there was a suspicion that the police case was, in fact, a series of trumped-up charges, and due to a certain resistance by the public to accept the police's story, information about the accused was conveniently leaked.
The leaked information we now know was edited in a highly selective fashion. The police claimed there was a credible threat against then US President George W. Bush, who was due to visit, except that threat turned out to be, how would you say?
It turned out to be a plan to use a catapult to launch a bus at the president's head.
A stunning number 8 wire plot, to be sure.
But also quite obviously not a serious threat, and most likely the idle musings of a few mates.
The Crown's case against the suspected terrorists eventually collapsed, although not until after the accused were placed in remand, forced to spend years getting ready for a court case and the like.
In retrospect, the best that can be said about the October raids is that the New Zealand police overreacted, whilst the worst that can be said is that this was just more troubling evidence of institutionalised racism in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Certainly the way in which elements of the government and the police tried to persuade the public that there were terrorists in their midst reeks of conspiracy. And for many people, the actions of then Prime Minister Helen Clark showed her to be no friend to Māori.
And now, an update on that Kenyan election.
Yes, in a previous episode, we cast scorn on the idea that the recent Kenyan election was rigged, pointing out that the accuser, opposition leader Raila Odinga, had claimed each and every election he had lost was fixed, despite international observers claiming otherwise.
However, just a few weeks later, we had to sheepishly report that the Kenyan Supreme Court had voided the election because of irregularities, and a new election had to be called. Now it turns out that Mr. Odinga will not be contesting that election in order to give the Electoral Commission enough time to introduce reforms that would help deliver a more credible election result.
Awkwardly, however, his counterpart in the government, Uhuru Kenyatta, is still planning to contest the election, which has led to Kenya's president asking that Mr. Kenyatta be declared the winner by default.
Odinga thought that by pulling out of the race, the election would have to be cancelled, which would have given the Electoral Commission time to reform the system, but the Electoral Commission has rejected the changes Odinga requested, largely apparently because of contractual agreements with the companies providing key services for said election.
The election has been scheduled for the 26th of this month, so expect updates on this in an episode or two.
Breaking news!
Already?
Yes, so a senior member of Kenya's Electoral Commission, Rosalind Akombem, claims the Commission is under political siege and unable to reach consensus or take any decisions, that the country is unable to hold credible elections next week.
Interesting.
Yes, she's fled to the US after receiving numerous death threats.
Well, that's scary.
Indeed, and now, an update on the PC wars.
Yes, I've been reading Trevor Loudon's blog, so most of you don't have to. According to columnist Lloyd Marcus, the current PC wars include a war on Christmas, on Easter, on Christianity,
Which kind of follows from the previous two items, really.
patriotism, the Founding Fathers,
Ooh, time travel.
marriage, babies, the Constitution, football, traditional families, and wars on masculinity, femininity, and gender distinction.
Remember, if you haven't enlisted to fight in these wars, get down to the imaginary recruitment offices and sign up today.
Please do. And now for Trump news.
This better be worth it.
Oh my yes, it turns out that Paul Manafort...
That's Trump's former campaign manager who's been in trouble for his ties to Russia.
That's him. Well, it turns out he has ties to Russia.
That's it?
Well, yes, but recent investigations have found that his financial ties to Russia, in particular the Kremlin-friendly oligarch Oleg Deripaska, are much greater than we first thought.
So he's up to his eyeballs in rubles. Does this mean anything significant beyond what we already know about the Trump campaign in Russia?
Not particularly. This story was really just an excuse to use the phrase eyeballs in rubles. It really trips off the tongue. Eyeballs in rubles, eyeballs in rubles, eyeballs in rubles. Actually, don't think I can stop saying it. Help me.
Well, let me flush your mind with a little talk about Australian politics.
Eyeballs.
In Australasia, that's both Aotearoa, New Zealand and Australia, our head of state is the Queen's representative known as the Governor-General. Now, the Governor-General is a titular position with no real power. They convene Parliament and sign off on laws, but they effectively act at the behest of the Prime Minister. However, back in 1975, the then Governor-General of Australia, Sir John Kerr, dismissed the government of the day, causing a constitutional crisis.
Rubles.
Fine, I'll carry on without you. New research by Professor of History Jenry Hocking has uncovered evidence that representatives of the British government flew to Australia before the dismissal of the government to meet with the Governor-General, which casts doubt on the official theory the Crown did not play an active role in that crisis. She believes the Queen knew what might happen to the government before it happened. She's now seeking access to papers held by the National Archives of Australia, which, interestingly enough, she might never see if Buckingham Palace decides the contents are not for public consumption.
Sounds conspiratorial.
Ah, you're back then, are you? Carry on.
In Do Vaccines Cause Autism news...
No.
Oh, you don't want me to do the segment then?
No, I'm just setting the record straight. That vaccines do not cause autism.
Well, then you'll like this story. A recent paper, very recent in fact, is dated December of this year, titled Subcutaneous Injections of Aluminium at Vaccine Adjuvant Levels Activate Innate Immune Genes in Mouse Brain that are homologous with biomarkers of autism, has already been retracted, remember it's been published in December of this year, because one of the co-authors now claims figures published in the study were deliberately altered before publication. Mysteriously enough, the original data is no longer accessible because the researcher who has it is in China, and the researchers failed to keep the data on a university server as was required.
Evidence of the data manipulation or fabrication came to light post-publication when people started looking at the data, which suggested the conclusion that vaccines were causing autism in mice.
Interestingly enough, one of the co-authors, Chris Shaw, has another retracted paper on the dangers of vaccines.
It all seems a little convenient. Shaw has appeared on documentaries about the dangers of vaccine, yet produces research on the topic, work which seems, well, dodgy. You'd almost think there was a conspiracy to produce academic literature to push the line that vaccines cause autism.
Almost. Finally, we can't really finish this segment without talking about the Harvey
And now it seems Bob.
Weinstein scandal, which looks like a conspiracy of silence writ large. Although a lot of people claim to have never known what happened, the fact settlements were paid out indicates that some people very much did know, and yet somehow some system,
Let's call it sexism and the patriarchy.
meant it was all kept very quiet, which allowed at least one Weinstein to continue their predilections.
And that, frankly, is disgusting. But it allows us to reference cult classic TV sitcom Action, the Jay Moore vehicle from back when Jay Moore was good. Action's about Moore's character Peter Dragon, who's trying to get a hit film off the ground after producing a total flop. He frequently has to take meetings with the creepy Rothstein brothers, who eventually only agree to make his film after Dragon forces his executive assistant to have a three-way with them.
This TV series was made in 1998. People knew about this for a long time. It turns out it's not so hard to manage a long-term cover-up if you're powerful and people are afraid of you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all the news that is fit to spit.
Fit to spit, I like it.
So do I.
Yep.
I think it should be our tag all the time now.
Yep.
That's all the news that fit... No, see, I can't say it now. All the news that's fit to spit.
Maybe it should have just been a one-off thing. I don't know.
We'll see.
We'll see
find-
next week. Who knows?
Next week. Who knows? Who knows?
Now, on to the main topic. So, once again, we're on false flags. We're looking at a different historical false flag that has been proven true. Essentially, that's the brief.
A warranted conspiracy
Warranted
theory, if you
conspiracy
like.
theory, indeed. So this week we're looking at the Lavon Affair. Now, I think what's interesting about this one, or what makes it slightly different from the ones we've looked at so far, is that the ones we've looked at so far tended to come out somewhat after the fact. In some cases, it was sort of there was like a change of government and tribunals and so on afterwards, or the Nuremberg trials in the case of some that happened in
Or
World War
last
II.
week, a historian gets access to the archives and the British government goes, you can reveal this one, but not the others, just this one.
Yeah, so in that case, this was a thing that didn't come out until over 60 years after it actually happened. But the one we're going to talk about today came out at the time. It essentially failed. It was an attempted false flag operation which got found out. And in fact, most of the interesting stuff, and the reason indeed why it's called the Lavon Affair in the first place, is because of all the political upheavals that happened as a result of it. But I suppose we should get straight into the operation
Yes.
itself, shouldn't we?
Tell me, Josh, what is the Lavon Affair?
Right, well, the Lavon Affair...
I mean, it sounds like a romance novel.
it does a little bit, yeah.
Except it's really not.
Really not at all romantic in
No.
any way, no. It's known euphemistically as the unfortunate affair or the bad business.
Which makes it sound very British, actually. It's kind of in the line of Operation Embarrass.
A little bit.
The unfortunate affair, or that bad business in Egypt.
Yes, well, this is how it was referred to in Israel, and this is what we're talking about. Because I believe at the time, a lot of the details that we're going to be talking about weren't known to the public. They were aware that ministers were resigning and stuff was happening, but they didn't actually know entirely what was going on, and the media wasn't allowed to talk about it. So referring to it euphemistically as this unfortunate affair, bad business, and so on, was sort of the way people were able to talk about it a little bit without properly talking about it. But the Lavon Affair centres around Operation Susanna, which was a false flag operation that Israel carried out in Egypt in 1954. Colonel Benjamin Ghibli, I don't know a lot about Hebrew names, I'm afraid I have to say.
I'm afraid
G's are normally
I
pronounced hard or
cannot
soft.
help you in this way.
At any rate, he was the chief of Amman, which is Israel's military intelligence, as opposed to Mossad, which is... What's the official... What do you call Mossad? The secret service policey thing.
Yes, I think that is the
that's
technical
exactly
term.
their name.
The secret service
The military-
policing thing.
yeah.
It's
At
how
any
they
rate.
keep most of their operations undercover, because we've got a secret service policing thing. Oh, don't be ridiculous.
At any rate, you have the Mossad and you have Amman, and that's the other one. And so these ones,
So basically MI5 versus MI6.
basically, yes. If I was a little bit cleverer, I would have said that. But thank you for saying it so that I did not have to.
Well, I did get the PhD.
You sure did. Yep. So the background is 1954. I'm not sure if Israel and Egypt were actually at war at that point, but they certainly were not on good speaking terms. Britain, however, and the US were getting a bit more chummy with Egypt. They had troops stationed there. Israel's worry was that the improvement in relations would mean that Britain and the US would start to pull their troops out of Egypt. And so to try and stop that from happening, they decided to embark upon a false flag campaign of bombings to try and sort of destabilise the region, get people more afraid, and prevent these troops from leaving. The acts were supposed to be blamed on either the Muslim Brotherhood or communists or just unspecified malcontents or nationalists. They recruited some Jewish Egyptians or Egyptian Jews. I never quite know which comes first, nationality or ethnicity/religion. At any rate, they were recruited to plant bombs. Now, it should be said that to their credit, the plan was to plant bombs in buildings after hours when no one would be around, and the bombings that did occur resulted in no casualties whatsoever.
So this was an attempt to create an act of terror as a political act, as opposed to create an act of terror which would actually cause civil
death and destruction. Yeah, well, some destruction, but yes. And indeed, as people have pointed out, the only deaths that actually resulted from these acts specifically were deaths of the operatives themselves, 2 of whom apparently committed suicide in prison, and 2 of whom were executed after the trial. But perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself.
You are getting ahead of yourself.
Because
let's focus on the moment, on the attacks.
Because there was a trial. What happened was there were some bombings, but the Egyptian authorities were tipped off. Now, by whom is a matter of some contention. I don't believe this has ever been.
That's a recurrent feature of this story. We know the events occurred, but exactly who was responsible for revealing things or planning things actually still remains a bit of a mystery.
So, nevertheless, someone shocked them to the authorities, and one would-be bomber, I believe one bomber's bomb detonated early while he was still carrying it, so I assume it didn't kill him, so I assume it partially went off or something, the fuse went off or something like that. And another man was captured. They took him back to his house, where they found various documents relating to the operation, which then allowed them to find out who else was involved. And so I think 9 people all up were arrested. And put on trial. So like I said at the start, this failed on the spot. They were found out. The attempt, not only were they caught, but their attempts to deny that Israel was behind it and that to try and blame it on someone else, that failed as well. They were put on trial. They confessed. And were convicted, and as I say, 2 of them were executed, and the remainder were given long prison terms in an Egyptian prison, which I understand was probably not a very nice place to be.
Which
especially
explains
if you were
why
Jewish.
2 of them committed suicide.
Yes, it does. So yeah, that's kind of it for the false flag operation itself. That's the whys and the wherefores, and the how we know about it is because it got rumbled on the spot. But then stuff got a little bit more interesting in the aftermath.
Well, yes, like most political events, people don't want to take responsibility for a wrongdoing. And so what we have here is a situation of people trying to shift the blame. So the Israeli government basically denied any involvement in the attacks whatsoever. So even though the Egyptian authorities could point towards it being Egyptians of Jewish extraction who were planning the bombings and did all the plotting, the Israeli government themselves were kind of able to do you can't show we actually ordered it, so...
And even if these people confessed to it, they could still say, well, yes, but this was all a show trial, it was a sham, it was a false confession.
They're trying to avoid going into an Egyptian prison, so they'll say whatever they can to get off, so you cannot trust them in this particular way. And basically, things started to rumble within Israel. So Lavon basically denied knowledge of the
I don't know if I actually
operation.
said at the start.
No, I don't think you did.
No, it's called the Lavon Affair because one of the people who ended up resigning was Pinhas Lavon, the Minister of Defence at the time. So he's the one who ended up copying it, basically. We know, as I said, that it was this Colonel Benjamin Ghibli who actually organised the operation. That much wasn't in doubt, but it was... Was it rogue elements, or was it something that had come from the top down of the government?
Yeah, so was it a government orchestrated affair, or was it elements within the military taking on a rogue
initiative
operation? Of course, if it turns out it was the military doing it without the government's behest, that actually gets us into an interesting definitional question. Is it a false flag when it's actually not being run by the states but only elements of the states.
I mean, I suppose certainly central to the plan was the idea that they were going to perform these attacks and then try to blame them on something else.
So yes, in that respect, it seems like a false flag.
But if we take false flags to mean at one state impersonating another state,
yes, then it ends up becoming, and of course it gets even trickier because of course in particular regimes, the military and the government are so tightly interlinked that you don't need a clear chain of command from the government to the military. You can just have the suggestion of, well, they passed each other in the halls of power and someone whispered something in someone's ear and it was never an official order, but it was kind of at the behest of the state because that's the way things work. So it gets quite tricky here to work out what we take the core definition of a false flag to be in this particular situation. But what's interesting about this story is, of course, the story keeps on shifting between it being a rogue operation being run by the Israeli military and it being a government-orchestrated affair.
So let me see if I get this right. First of all, there was an investigation. So Lavon himself denied all knowledge.
This was an investigation in Israel?
In Israel, I believe. This was secret at the time. This was
Yes,
within the Israeli government.
Earlier, the media weren't able to report as to why political turmoil was going on at the time. So all Israelis knew was that there had been a political crisis of some kind, which meant that ministers were being questioned, the Prime Minister had to issue statements, but they didn't know why the actual events in Egypt were being kept secret.
So yes, Lavon said he had no knowledge of it. Ghibli said, no, I did it at Lavon's bequest. So the initial investigation included that Lavon did know about it and he resigned. But then things got a little bit murky. Now maybe this is a good time to introduce this man called Avri Elad, who was supposedly the Israeli handler of the operatives in Egypt. And supposedly he's the one who actually betrayed Israel and dobbed these guys into the Egyptians. This was claimed, it was never proven. However, sometime later, this guy was indeed convicted of selling secrets to the Egyptians in a completely different completely different matter. So it doesn't look good for him. Nevertheless, he was one of the people, along with Colonel Ghibli, who testified that yes, Lavon was in the know about this. But a second, there were sort of irregularities found, suspicions that certain documents had been were fraudulent or had been tampered with, and suggestions that some of the testimony, in particular from this fellow Avri Elad, might have been perjury. So there was a second inquiry. The second inquiry reversed the decision of the first. Essentially, they concluded that these certain people had perjured themselves, that Lavon hadn't authorised this false flag operation. Rather, he was being used as the fall guy. Essentially, the people who were actually responsible for it were trying to pin it on him.
But then there was a third inquiry, which basically reversed the findings of the second inquiry, which had reversed the findings of the first inquiry, which meant the third inquiry confirmed the findings of the first inquiry because they reversed the findings of the second inquiry. Confused yet? You should be.
Yes, there's a lot of politics to it. I really couldn't follow it entirely, to be perfectly honest. Essentially, certain people weren't happy. They tried to, after the second one, I think they tried some sort of compromise position where they'd release a statement that both sort of... They tried to do one of those ones where essentially we are admitting to everything that says we were wrong without admitting that we were wrong, sort of thing. You know, that sort of thing they try in politics sometimes. But people weren't happy with that, and so they did for the third one. And the end result of that was that even, I believe, Prime Minister at the time, David Ben-Gurion, also resigned. So
basically political turmoil throughout Israel at that time.
So yeah, it ended up being a big thing. Of course, especially, I mean, it's politics and false flag operations and murky stuff, and then it's Israel on top of that. Anything to do with Israel essentially is going to be fairly contentious because there are people who really do not like Israel, and then there are people who really do. I mean, I did a bit of reading about this as well, and I sort of found one video talking about it that insisted on referring to Israel as the apartheid state of Israel every time they mentioned it, and the whole tenor of it was, look how evil Israel is. They did this false flag attack. They're probably doing it in America now. On the other side of things, I read about it at the Jewish Virtual Library, which took a very pro-Israel spin on it. One, though, that didn't actually deny that this had taken place, but it very much spent a lot of time talking about the political situation which was sort of used to justify this in the first place. Spent a lot of time talking about the suffering of these people in Egyptian prison, which I don't doubt for a second would have been a horrible time. So everybody's got their spin, basically.
Yes, and actually, as you say, when it comes to issues about Israel and Israel's external politicking, a lot of assumptions are brought to the table before the analysis begins, given the contentious way that Israel is treated in the West, basically, between the Zionist and the anti-Zionist camps, and that particular kind of rhetoric infects the way you talk about what happened at that time.
So, in the end, we're still not 100% certain who knew what and when, and who was actually behind all this. In 2015, so only a couple of years ago now, the IDF released, the IDF Israeli Defense Force.
That's correct.
The IDF released documents, sort of declassified, I assume, old documents, one of which included a transcript of a conversation between Ghibli and Lavon, which suggests that it was Ghibli's thing and that Lavon didn't know about it. Nothing. They don't say anything overtly incriminating, but the way they're talking about it and the things they say sort of imply that yes, Lavon was wrongly maligned. But
once again, given the tight interplay between the military and the government in Israel, you can also imagine it's one of those things where there would be no explicit document by Lavon to Ghibli or any explicit conversation. It is the kind of thing that could be done with a nod and a wink. Just like that.
Yes. And I suppose one final thing is that, again, the Israeli government at the time denied any knowledge and had sort of remained quiet about it ever since then, until 2005, when the Israeli government honoured the surviving operatives. I believe 3 of them were still alive at that time. And presented certificates of commendation, basically, to these operatives, which was taken to be them officially acknowledging that this operation was done by Israel.
That's a kind of a weird thing to do, commemorating people who either did or were about to commit an act of terrorism in a foreign country. It reminds me an awful lot about what happened to our local terrorists, not the October raids, but the fact that the French performed a terrorist act in the Auckland harbour, the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior. And when the operatives were captured by the New Zealand police and imprisoned here, the French government said, no, we want them back, we will put them on trial. And the New Zealand government went, we don't think you will. And France said, no, we're a nation of law and order. We will put them on trial. They'll be dealt with appropriately. And the government of the day went, okay, fine, we don't want to cause a diplomatic issue. We will send the bombers back to Paris so you can put them on trial. And the bombers arrived in Paris to a victory parade.
Yes, I mean, I suppose that's particularly damning in that, they went straight from New Zealand to a victory parade and then sort of spent a couple of years
in a luxury resort, aka prison on a Pacific island.
Whereas, at least in the case of the Lavon Affair, these people being honoured did serve 10 years, quite hard time.
But at the same
for
time,
their troubles.
Why honour them for that particular action?
Yes, so
just seems a bit weird.
It does seem a little weird, but that's politics.
It is.
So, is there any sort of a moral we can take from this? I suppose false flags do get found out sometimes. They're not always.
Well, I think actually the biggest moral to take from this one is the interesting aspect of people in Israel not knowing what's going on. So presumably in Egypt, this was all over the news. Captured Egyptian Jews, tried to bomb buildings in Cairo, issues in Israel, people being blamed, etc., etc. But people in Israel had no idea. They knew there was a political crisis going on due to turmoil, resignations, and the like. But they didn't know why. And so in this particular respect, the false flag is fascinating for the fact that even though we know about it now, at the time, people were aware something had gone on, but probably thought it was normal politicking. Oh, there's been some kind of issue in the government. People are scrambling to try and take advantage of it, not knowing the issue was in fact an act of conspiracy in an overseas state. And that once again speaks to the idea there are probably a lot more of these events out there. The ones we know about are probably only the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, I mean, when we talked about at the start the fact that it was, referred to by these euphemisms like the unfortunate affair,
and the bad business.
People in the know, there were people who knew what was going on, and I'm not quite sure how sort of widespread this was. So people were talking about it in very cryptic terms. That it was certainly the case that they couldn't report on it openly. There was some discussion of it in very sort of coded language, but yeah, essentially it was this thing that was affecting the government in a fairly momentous way that was essentially kept from the people.
Yeah, as one is wont to do when one is caught committing a conspiracy. You don't really want people to know about it.
Now, Pat, you mentioned the way it was reported in Egypt. One thing I probably should say is that the trials that went on in Egypt, certainly some certainly on the Israeli side sort of did condemn these as just being mere show trials, and the question their guilt was, the verdicts were never in question. It was merely essentially how many they could get away with executing and how many they could.
So a classic case of everyone agrees they're guilty, but you still have a show trial to display to the populace how bad the enemy is, and also to build up a case that we can give them the worst possible punishment. So we know they're going to be found guilty. The question is, how guilty can we make them be in order to punish them?
The usual matter of, there was politics at play there, of course, as well, because that sort of Egypt could extract political concessions from Israel in exchange for not executing all of their prisoners and so on and so forth. So, politics is a murky business, Matthew.
Is it?
A murky business.
Yes, actually, no, you're right, it is.
It actually is. In fact, changing topic slightly, but on a related note, murky as evidenced by the fact that 2 weeks after the election, we still don't have a government in New Zealand.
No. Although we apparently will know by lunchtime tomorrow.
Really?
Yeah.
Is that the latest deadline?
It is the latest
The last
deadline.
few deadlines
have sailed past.
Yes. So you'll notice Matthew and I are fairly sanguine about all this. People aren't rioting in the streets because we don't have a government immediately after an election. This is mixed member proportional representation. That's how it works.
Coalitions take time to form, and actually it does look as if the coalition's been formed in a fairly reasonable, logical way at this stage.
Yes, it certainly does. From what we hear is largely, policy discussions. It's not each party trying to out-bribe the other one to get...
It is a case of how close do our policies fit with yours, let's come to an agreement. And from the sounds of it, they've probably come to the agreement, they're just not going to announce it until tomorrow.
Well, yes. Now, Winston Peters, if you're not in New Zealand or listening to this, you may not have heard of Winston Peters.
Winston Raymond Peters.
Indeed. A man who's been in New Zealand politics longer than I have been alive.
There is a painting from ancient Rome that shows them arguing with the two proconsuls.
While that is a lie, it is true that he's been in...
Yes, right, because there's really only ever one proconsul at a time. You caught me out there, Joshua. Clever.
It has been pointed out that Winston Peters has been in Parliament for more than 40 years, and the New Zealand Parliament itself is only around 160 years old. So he's been around for a full quarter of the length of the existence of the New Zealand government. Anyway,
and plans to be around for another
he does.
at least.
So the thing about Winston is he loves the spotlight. He loves the boogie. He
At
loves
the disco.
disco.
Hey! Yeah.
And as people have pointed out, while at the moment his party is acting as kingmaker because he has enough votes to either give the control of the government to the right-wing National Party or the left-wing Labour Greens coalition, he has all the power right now. Once the government's formed, he just goes back to being a minor party in a large coalition, and essentially loses a whole bunch of his power. So he's basically milking this for all it's worth, as is his wont.
Yes.
So let him
And
have his
also
day in the sun.
Is his
It's not
right,
gonna
and
last.
under a proportional system, he has the necessary votes to get a majority government. He has the right to extract policy concessions from either side to get a governing majority for a government to be formed. That's just the way that democracy works.
Well, yes, unless you listen to some people here who, despite 21 years of MMP, still don't really seem to get it, and still want elections to be basically like some sort of a running race or a contest where one party wins and their prize is they get to do whatever they want for the next 3 years.
Which led,
is not.
for a very long time,
Yes.
minority governments holding absolute sway, which is just not democratic.
No.
At least not democratic in my world.
No, and so we don't. So you don't end up with a situation like in Britain. Was it last election or the one before? Where
Last election.
They ended up with a hung parliament because no one party had a majority, and they're like, horror, shock and horror. This is the worst thing ever, and we're like, this is how it happens every time.
Yeah.
And indeed, in other parties, other countries, much more proportionate than us, we still have the two major parties, and MMP simply allows smaller parties to exist. But I believe in sort of the Scandinavian countries, there is no real majority party. A coalition will be made up of, there'll be like 5 parties each with an equal share of the seats.
And Angela Merkel's party has 32.5% of the vote, and she's the Chancellor of Germany.
And indeed, I believe it's not unknown for sort of a politician from a minor party to end up being like Prime Minister or something, just as the way the coalitions shake out, maybe because... I don't know specific examples, but I can imagine a situation where you sort of, got the two bigger, more dominant parties can't agree on whether this one or this one gets to put the Prime Minister forward, so they compromise by giving it to the middle one, and that way everyone's happy.
Now, the important thing to note about this conversation is there's no conspiracy involved
None
here at all.
whatsoever.
We're just informing you as to what's happening with our election, because I'm sure by this time next week we'll have a new segment talking about whoever is on the opposition claiming it was a conspiracy by Winston Peters and the party of the government to basically milk concessions or embarrass people. Who knows? There'll be a conspiracy theory about it in a week's time.
I think that is relevant. I think it is relevant to this podcast, and the fact that no conspiracies exist, that political coalition bargaining can go on, and people complain that Winston Peters is kingmaker, and yes, people complain that these deals are happening behind closed doors, but no one's crying conspiracy yet, which I think is probably a good thing in a healthy democracy.
Good.
Good. So there we go.
Yeah.
Everything is light and roses and happiness and unicorns.
This is the point where I should get a hammer and hit you in the head or stab you or
You probably
something
should,
just to lighten the mood with a bit of murder. But
instead, we'll just go out with the usual contact details stuff, I think.
Yeah,
so
which is actually all encapsulated on the podcast version with a little sting at the end.
Do we have a new sting? I've been using the old sting for the video. Do we have a new one with all the contact details? Because the old one I have gives our email address and details of the patronage campaign. I don't think it talks about us.
No, it doesn't really.
No, which is good, because that gives us an excuse to talk about ourselves at the end of every episode.
You love talking about yourself. You know me, I'm very modest, very humble. I don't like to big up myself at
Shy
any
and
particular
retiring,
point in
that's
time.
what I say.
Yeah? So it's not even my real face.
Nevertheless, this is the real podcaster's guide to the conspiracy.
This is my real face.
No, it does, yeah, no, I wouldn't go at it too hard. You don't know what will happen.
Oily.
You may be watching the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy on YouTube. If you're not and you'd like to, just go on YouTube and search the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy. You are possibly more likely, I don't know, we haven't looked at the stats, listening to this as a podcast, which you can do on iTunes and on Stitcher and on a few other places.
Yeah.
If you want to get in touch with me, Josh Addison, the easiest way is probably to get in touch on Twitter, where I go by the name Monkey Fluids. Over to you.
Well, you can contact with me. You can find me on Twitter with the handle Conspiracism, where I tweet about conspiracies. It's quite logical, really.
Yeah.
And I have a website. It's episto.org. That's EPISTO.org, where I sometimes write about conspiracy theories, but mostly put up links to the podcast and the video because I'm very busy with other writing projects at the moment.
Anything else? We have an email address. Stick around at the end to hear that. It'll be a surprise. A shocking and interesting
And
surprise.
also because we always get it wrong.
Yes, we do have a bad history with that. The little bit at the end will also mention that we have patronage campaigns on both Patreon and on the website where this podcast is officially hosted, which is podbean.com. So you can find it at conspiracism.podbean.com and check out what's there. You can leave comments and do all that. So actually leave comments, just in general, wherever you are, YouTube, iTunes, everywhere. Leave comments and rate and subscribe and thumbs up. Just all the thumbs up. Anywhere they'll fit.
Favorite.
Stick those thumbs just up.
Yeah.
Just all the way up.
Yeah. If there's somewhere you can stick your thumb.
As long as you're sticking your thumb up. Don't be sticking your thumbs down.
And also always ask first.
Yes, consent is important.
It is.
And I think that's the end.
Yes.
Yes.
I think we've rambled on for too long. So now it is time for us to say goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. You've been listening to The Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, starring Josh Addison and Matthew R.X. Dentith, and produced by Matthew R.X. Dentith. If you've enjoyed The Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, why not contribute to our Patreon or Podbean patron page? And you can contact us on podcastconspiracy@gmail.com. That's podcastconspiracy@gmail.com.